Okay, in this video we're going to be learning about the CSS Position property. And then once we go through how the position property actually works, we're going to be using JavaScript to manipulate the value of the CSS Position property. Okay, so to get started, I'm on my desktop here and I've created this file cssposition.html. So I'm going to begin with a basic HTML document. We've done many times before. We'll call this CSS Position. And then I'm going to make a style tag and a script tag. Oops. There we go, get my bearings. Okay, starting application. So we do a quick console.log in the script area just to check to make sure the JavaScript is running, and then we'll add a little background color on the body. Just do that just to make sure the styles are all working properly. And margin 0. Alright. And we can refresh this. When we see the background color change slightly, we're going to add a little heading. So H1. And then we're going to add a div. That's going to be kind of our main content div. So we can add a class here and we'll call this content. Or we could call it main or something like that. Right? And then underneath that, we're going to have eventually some JavaScript controls. So div. Well, there'll be HTML controls, but they will function because of the JavaScript we add to them. Okay, so there we go. We've got a couple divs, page heading, we're going to align the text in the center. Got content and controls. So we'll say the content has a width of 100%. Same with the controls. Then we'll give the height of this, let's say 600 pixels. And the height of controls, 150 pixels. There we go. And just to make sure we can tell what's happening, we're going to add a background color to both of these. Start out red, and this will be duplicate that line and move it down and make this one blue. This won't stay this way. It's just so we can tell what's going on when we reload this page. Okay, so there's our red and our blue. So it's a little bit too big for us right now. So we might make this 400 and 100. Got a smaller screen here for the visual demo. Okay, so that's not bad. Make it 300. There we go. Okay, so those are our two divs. We'll make them a little bit nicer. So we'll make the background color of the body dark and the color of the text light, and then these two we'll make lighter colored, and the controls will be a little bit darker, so they'll be like that. There we go. So CSS position, the background. This is kind of our staging area. This is where we're going to add a few div elements that have that are CSS positioned. Okay, and we'll go over what that means exactly. And then down here, eventually we're going to have some controls to manipulate the items up here. All right. So to get started here, let's first add some basic content. So what we're going to add is 3 individual boxes, and inside of each box there's going to be content. It could be an image or it could be something else, but each one of these, the middle box, we're going to try to manipulate and show what the CSS position property can do. All right, so we're going to add a bunch of divs here. So this will be a box. And inside of each box, there's going to be, we'll call it a dummy. It's going to be a blank white box. Okay, so I'm copy and pasting this. Alright. So we have class box, and then ID property. This is going to be box 1. Box 1, there we go. And this will be box 2. And this will be box 3. Okay, so all we have is 3 divs. Inside of each div is another div that just says dummy. And none of these have any content, so we're going to have to add CSS to be able to see them. If I just reload the page, nothing changes because these divs don't have any height or width, and you can't see anything. There's no background color to tell what's happening with the divs. So we have to add some CSS before we can really see what this is doing. All right, so let's do that. We're going to make each of our boxes have this CSS. We're going to make them eventually we're going to make them display inline block, but first I'm going to set colors on them so that we can see them. So we're going to do that with the ID selector. So the hashtag is selecting items with an ID of, and this will be box 1, and we're going to set a background color, and this can be some sort of gray here. We can make all of them have that background color. We'll do box 1, box 2, and box 3 if we need them. And then we'll have a height and width. So height and width of 100 pixels on all of our boxes. So box 1, box 2, and box 3. And then we have inside we have the dummy, and this is going to be sort of the same thing. But the background color here is going to be white, so we'll just make that all the way up. Alright, so this box is around the dummy, so we do want a little padding here. So actually we can get rid of the height and width here. We just want some padding of maybe 25 px around everything. Excuse me. Alright, so here we go. Now this main div here is our content div, right? And what's happened here is all of the divs we added, right here, box 1, box 2, and box 3, they are display block, which means nothing can be to the left or to the right of them. Okay, so if we right click on this, right, we see they are one line each, right? What we actually want is we want these to line up next to each other. Okay, so here's our box 1, and then we have the dummy, which is 100 by 100, right? And here we have box 1. So what we want to do is make this display inline block so they can line up beside one another. Whoops, not on dummy, we want that on our box. Okay, so these outer divs, right, that's what we want to be display inline block, each one of these. Alright, so we reload the page, and there we go. So now we can kind of see, the border area, right, here, this is the box elements, and then inside here we have this dummy element. Alright, so inside the stage, this content area, we might want to center this, and we might want to bring it down a little bit, add a little padding. Okay, so inside of content, we'll say padding on the top will be 30px, and then on the sides will be 50px. There we go. And then it's still, we might want to center it. Okay, so we can do, since we've changed it to the display inline block, right, each of the boxes, we can now text align center them. And there we go. So now these are centered, so that's nice. And let's actually add a little bit more padding on top. Let's see, that's 50. So we'll add 100. Yeah, that should be good. Oh, that's the sides. We still want 50 on the sides. Alright, so we'll do, I guess, 75 here. There we go. Alright, so this is a little bit too big. Right, and I believe this has to do with our box sizing. So let's go ahead and fix our box sizing. So all of our elements should, usually you're going to want this box sizing border box. Okay, so what that does is means whenever you specify a width or a height or something like that, since we have width and heights specified, that width or that height is talking about the content and the padding and the border. Okay, so that is what width and height stand for when you have border box as your box sizing, right? The default is the height and width is just the content, so you have to add in the padding and add in any border, and then that essentially, it winds up being a whole lot of extra work. So adding box sizing, border box helps a lot, and you see that kind of straightened up our flow here. Okay, so we've got this content here, we've got these 3 boxes. Down here we're going to be adding some controls eventually. Alright, inside here we can add, just to identify the particular element we're going to be looking at, we're going to add an image, and we'll do place puppy here. Source equals http place -puppy.com/ and we want 100 by 100. So the image cannot have any child content. It's a void element. Excuse me. And when we reload this page, we're going to see the alignment will shift here. Okay, so the alignment by default, if there's no content, it aligns at the bottom of the div. But now that there's an image content, it aligns to the bottom of that that image content. Right. So what we want to do is on each one of these box items, we're going to add vertical align middle. And that will align them all together. Vertical align middle. Reload the page. There we go. So the main reason we've done this is the element that we're going to be modifying the CSS position property on. Okay. So first, let's just take a look at the CSS position property and look what it does. All right. So to use the CSS position property, box 2, right? That is the item that has our puppy image. So that's the item we're going to be trying to manipulate with this. So the CSS property is position, and the default value for that is static. Okay, that means position the element statically. There's a normal flow, right? So with inline elements, they flow from the left to the right. This one, then that one, then that one. This is called the flow. This is the normal flow of the layout, right? So position static essentially just means leave the flow in the normal flow of the document. Okay. We can also have position relative. Okay. Position relative means relative to its normal flow, where would you like to position this item? Okay. And there are 4 different CSS properties you can use to position this thing relatively. You can use a top, and we can say, let's see, 20px, and then left 20px. Okay, we reload the page, and what we're saying is from the top of where it should be, you're coming down 20 pixels, and then from the left hand side, you're going to be 20 pixels from that. Okay, so you're adding space from the top from the bottom. I believe you can do negative as well. Right, and you see that. Now, because we have this background here and these are kind of blending, let's go ahead and add a border, and that's going to help us tell the difference between these items when this background colors collide a little bit. So let's add a border to each of our boxes. Right, border, very simple. We'll do solid black 1px. There we go. Alright, so now we see this one has shifted, right? And so it's the amount of space that you add from the top, right? And if you go negative, it will go from its normal flow position. Now this is all because of position relative, right? So you can have top, left. The other 2 you can have, I'm going to comment these out. And instead, I'm going to use bottom 20px and right 20px. Okay, so this in essence shouldn't change anything, because now instead we're going from the bottom and we're going up 20 pixels, and from the right we're going over 20 pixels, right? So it's essentially the same as going top -20 and left -20, right? So those are the 4 main CSS properties that you're going to want to use with position relative, or just with position in general. Now notice we go back to static, these values have no function, right? Reload the page and see we're just back in the normal static flow. All right, but notice when we go to relative, we can now use these positionable CSS properties, top, bottom, left, and right, and notice it still holds space for the flow, right? We have this box, and then where this box would have been is still there. I can change these dramatically. I can say 200 pixels, and it's relative to where it would normally be in the flow, but also the flow, its position in the flow is maintained, right? So these 2 elements still respect where this item would have been, okay? With the other position elements here, it doesn't respect that. It takes it out of the flow. Okay, so the other options are fixed. Okay, so we can say fixed, and that is fixed to the viewport. So we'll put this back down to 20, and we can reload this. And so it's fixed to the screen. Now let me add some additional content down here so you can see when I scroll, this is always going to be fixed. And it also took it out of the flow. We see it's no longer in the flow here. All right, so let's add some stuff at the bottom, a bunch of BR tags. And I'll just duplicate that a whole bunch so we can scroll. And see, now when we scroll up and down, this remains fixed to the viewport. If I close my developer tools, right, it's always up, you know, from the bottom 20 pixels and from the right 20 pixels. And again, with position fixed, it comes out of the flow. All right, the other item is position absolute. Now this one causes confusion because position absolute is actually, it's relative, it's just not relative to its usual position. So position relative is relative to where the object is normally supposed to be in the flow. It's relative to where it would be statically positioned. Okay. Position absolute is going to be relative to the previously last positioned element. Okay. So up here, if I on, let's see, this element, this div here, this is called our content element. If I make this one position absolute, that doesn't do anything if I don't add top, left, bottom, or right. Right? So I can do, or position relative, right? Let's do position relative because that keeps it in the flow, right? This doesn't really do anything. It doesn't change where it is, where this element is located, right? Because I didn't add top, bottom, left, or right properties. But this is the last positioned element. So now when I go down here to box, if I position absolutely, it's going to position it relative to the last positioned element. Okay, so this is kind of named a little bit poorly and it's a little bit confusing. But just remember, position relative is relative to its normal position, and then position absolute is relative to the last positioned item. Okay, so here, if we reload that, now we see this div, right? This was our content div. This one is the div that we positioned, and now we're over 20. From the right-hand side, we're over 20, and from the bottom, we're over 20, right? Whereas fixed, and this doesn't stay fixed like it did to the viewport. Okay, so this is positioning it relative to another position, another positioned HTML element. But also notice it came out of the flow again, right? So the two CSS positions that keep the flow are static, which is just the normal position, the normal flow, and then relative. So both static and relative keep the item in flow, right? Then if we use absolute or fixed, it pulls the item out of the flow. All right. So now what we're going to try to do is set these properties here. We're going to set those with JavaScript controls. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to have a drop-down menu that selects the kind of position. Right. So we're going to say it's position either static, relative, absolute, or fixed. Okay, so what we need to do is add some CSS controls, or some HTML controls. So under here in controls, let's add, let's see, in controls, we're going to do text align center, just to keep our controls in the middle of the page. And what we want to add first is a select tag. So a select tag is going to be a drop-down menu, and for each option tag inside, you can specify a value attribute on the option, and when you grab this element from JavaScript, this value is the value you can get back from the control, okay? Whereas the child content is what's actually displayed on the screen, okay? So we'll do a demo of this real quick. So this one, the value here, to make it obvious, we'll make this one all lowercase. So static is the default value, and then we'll make this all uppercase, right? So you'll see when we get this back from JavaScript, we don't get the uppercase version back. When we access this drop-down control and get the selected value, it's going to be the lowercase version of whichever one is selected, because that's the value. Because that's the value attribute here. There we go. So here we're going to use lowercase relative and then say relative. So those are the two that are in flow, and then we have absolute and fixed. Okay, so we can refresh the page, and here we see the drop down. We have these. Right, so this is a little bit in our face. Let's dial that back down and make these just normal, static. Right, but they are still capitalized. Right, the first letter is capitalized. So you'll see when we get this back from JavaScript, we'll get the lowercase version. There won't be a capital S on these. Okay, and then the other thing, we might want to add a little padding here. All right, so on our controls menu, our controls div, we add some padding. We can say for the top, maybe 30px, and then for the sides, maybe 80. All right, there we go. So that's getting us somewhere. And this looks a little nicer, right? We got some padding. So when I select one of these, what I want to happen is I'm going to have to execute some JavaScript. So there's an event taking place. Okay, JavaScript is event-based. So when the event happens, and the event that I'm talking about is changing the value of this control. So we have a select control here. When I change that value, so basically when I select a different one, when I change that value, I want to run some JavaScript. Okay, so the event is called onChange. So if we attach that to our select control, right, onChange, right, we can select an item. All right, so onChange, we're going to call some JavaScript function, right? And this function is going to be basically, you know, update element. Okay, because we have an element, which is this box 2 item. We're going to update the CSS on that element. Okay. So what I need here is also an ID. This ID for the select control is going to be position select or position drop down, something like that. But I need an ID so I can grab it from JavaScript. All right, and so when this changes on change on that event, this function is going to be called. Now we don't have that function yet, so we need to go down here and define it here in our JavaScript. Right, so function, and this, what did we want to call it? Update element. Update element. All right, so now we have this function, console.log, and let's just test it to make sure it works. Running update element. Okay, so this is just, again, a function definition. The function definition will not execute the code in the body of that function definition until the function is called. So the function will be called when this event happens. Right? So we reload the page. let's open up our developer tools. This warning is just associated with our puppy, right? And now when I change this, so I'm going to click on relative, we see update element executed. Anytime this value changes, we see the console.log takes place. Right? Now notice if I select fixed again, nothing happened because the value did not change. So just because I select it again does not mean the function will run again. It will only run if the controls value has changed. So that's important. All right, so we go back here. Instead of just this console.log, what we actually want to do is we want to grab the select control. So we're going to grab the drop down. Let dd equal, this is the drop down element. Right? We're going to use document.get element by ID. Okay, and we can do that, and we can grab position dropdown. All right, let me grab that, and we can console.log that. del. Click, and then sure enough. So we can print out the value, dot value. So this is when you have an element, you've grabbed an element with document.get element by ID, you can access the attributes usually with dot value or get attribute, right? But with controls, you can just access that with dot value. So I'll replace that. When we change this, we see it says relative. Notice it's in lowercase, right? Absolute lowercase, even though it's uppercase here. Fixed lowercase. So this is whatever option here is selected, the value associated with that option is what's being returned to our element dot value. Okay, so this is the drop down element. So what we want to do is we now want to grab this item, our puppy dog, right? So we'll put the CSS back so he's just in the normal flow. We'll make it static by default. All right, so he's back in the flow. We're going to try to grab this element and then apply the CSS position property to it. Okay, so we've got our drop-down element. We want to grab our puppy. Let puppy element equal. Now there's an additional way you can grab elements. It's a little bit nicer actually. It's called query select. So document dot query selector, and you can use query selectors like you do in CSS. So in the CSS, when we want to select items with class, the attribute class set to controls, we use this dot, which means select all items with the class and then controls. If we want to select items with an ID, we use a hash and then the ID value, right? So these are CSS selectors. It's a query selector, and any CSS selectors you use up here, you can now use, this is a somewhat new feature, you can use them with document.querySelector. So if I wanted to access an element by ID, I can use document.querySelector. If I wanted to access the same element, right, I would use hash dropdown, position dropdown, right? So this would access the same element as up here, right? I just use query selector, and so I'm accessing the item with the ID, right? If I want to access items with a class, query selector just returns one item, the first item it encounters. If you want to select all the elements, so if you use a class name and you want all of the elements, you'd use query selector all, and that would return a list of all of the elements that match the query selector. So if my query selector starts with a dot, that means all of the elements that start with or that have the class, and in this case we want the class to be box, right? This would select all of the items box, right? So we could do box here, and this would actually select all of the items. This wouldn't be the puppy element, this would actually be a list, right? So we can console.log that and see that we actually do have a list here. Log that out, So remember, query selector all is going to return a list. It's going to find all of the elements that match this, not just one. Query selector by itself just finds one. So we review that. Absolute. And so we have a node list here. You see there's 3 items, right? Box 1, box 2, and box 3. Right? That's what the query selector all did. Okay, but technically all we want is box 2. Right, so we can instead of this query selector all, we'll use query selector and we'll say we want box -2. Okay, so that's our actual puppy element, right? And so we can reload the page, try this again, and sure enough, that's our puppy element. We have that one now. So what we want to do is we want to set one of the attributes on this HTML element, right? As we remember, the attributes of an HTML element are anything you add in the tag opening, right? So this is the tag name, and then separated by spaces are the attributes. And so you have the attribute name, an equal sign, and then the attribute value. Sometimes you just have an attribute name and there's no value, right? But those are attributes. So in JavaScript, the way you modify those attributes, I could say get my element, puppy element, there we go, dot set attribute. Okay, and this takes 2 arguments. The first argument is the attribute that you want to set. So I want to set the style attribute, so I can modify the CSS of just this one particular element. And then what do I want to set that attribute to? Okay, so style can be a whole bunch of CSS. So what I want this to be is position, colon, and then I want to add in our drop-down value. Right? Because this is what the value is selected from our drop-down. Right? Drop-down element dot value. So position now is going to be set to either static, relative, absolute, or fixed. And then we'll add in our semicolon. Right? So this is going to grab our puppy element. Right? We did document query selector, box 2. It grabs our puppy element. Then that element, puppy element dot set attribute. So on that element, we're setting the attribute style, which is essentially no different than coming up here and adding style. You know, position relative or something like that. It's no different than this, except I'm doing it with JavaScript. Okay, so instead of adding that in the HTML, I'm doing it with JavaScript. And then the nice thing of JavaScript is I can add something dynamically. If I type it in here, it's set. It's statically set. But with JavaScript, that's the nice thing about JavaScript. You can change things dynamically. All right. So set attribute, style, position. All right. Reload the page. Relative, absolute, fixed. Back to static. Okay, now if we wanted to get a little bit fancier, we could add, you know, top, bottom, left, and right values. Right, so we could say under here in controls, we can add a BR tag. Oops, BR. And then we're going to add a label. So a label basically just means the text inside of a label will, if you click on that label, it will select a particular control. So here this is going to be, we'll call this bottom colon. And then inside of here, we're going to have an input control that's just a text box. Input type equals text. Okay. The input control is a void element, so it can't have children. So I close this, but you don't have to. I self-close it. Okay, so now whenever I click this bottom label, the input here inside of the label will get focus. Okay, so see there's bottom, and I click on it, and we get focus. So that kind of just helps the user access the controls a little bit in a little bit nicer way. Okay, so we'll add one more BR tag here to add a little extra space. There we go. and we might have to add some height to our controls. Heights, make it 150. There we go. And we're going to add one more down here. And color needs to go to black here. There we go. Alright, so we're going to add bottom and right. Okay, so we also need to set IDs here. And then ID here is CSS right. Okay, we might want to add a couple BR tags. There we go. Click bottom, that gets focused. Click right. Alright, we don't just want text though, really. Ideally, we want numeric fields. So instead of type text, we can say type number for these. And when we do that, it restricts what we can add. I can't type any, you can hear me clicking, I can't type any character data unless it's character data that can be representing a number. So I can type in numbers, and also you can do the minus sign because you could have -1, and you can do the dot, right? So this isn't perfect, but it does restrict some of your inputs, right? This isn't a real number. You know, you can have an E for scientific notation, stuff like that. It does restrict some of the things that you can type in. At least Chrome does, right? But the main thing is you can go up and down. You get this little arrow up and down. And you can also set a maximum and a minimum. Okay, so we might say we want the maximum to be, I don't know, 100, and the minimum to be like -50 or something. So we can add that in here. We'll say the minimum is going to be -100, and then the max will be 800, I guess. And then we'll do that for both of these. And we can set the initial value to 0 for both of them as well. Alright, so when I reload the page, they both start at 0. If I go to -100, that's fine, but it won't let me go below that. I can go up, but once I try to go below, it just stops. If I say -200 and press enter, right, technically it's not supposed to allow that. But yeah, if I go up and down, it just jumps back up to the minimum, right? And here we had 800, so I can have 799, right, and then up. So now what we want to do is anytime either one of these change, these values, right, we want to update the element, right? So we want to run this. So anytime these change, we're going to say on change. We're going to run our same function, update element. And we're calling that function, right? We have to have the left and right parentheses. Okay, so this is basically JavaScript that gets called when this event occurs on this HTML element. Okay, and we want the same thing to happen down here on this one. Okay, so now the issue becomes, actually let's make the defaults here 20. Make that 40. Okay. And then up here, bottom right, 40. So I'm just making these match what our defaults are here. All right. And then update element. So now we have to grab these two elements, get the values, and set the style with those as well. So that's going to set the bottom CSS property and the right CSS property. Okay, so we can go through this. Let's see, this will be bottom input. This is the bottom element. Document dot query selector. I want to grab the item that has the ID CSS bottom. Right? CSS bottom. So that's going to grab this input element. Right? And I want to get the value there. Whatever the user has typed in is going to be the value, and it's going to start here at 20. So CSS bottom, I'm grabbing that item. We can go ahead and grab the right element. CSS right. Okay. This set attribute, this needs to come down to the very bottom, right? Because this is the last thing we do. We're going to set position, and we're going to add some other CSS, right? So we're going to add some CSS here. Let CSS equal, and this is essentially the value of the style property we want to be here. So we're going to copy and paste this. Copy. Okay, so all I did was I moved this data that was here, I set it in a variable, and then that's going to allow me to add more to this. CSS plus equals, so take whatever CSS existed, whatever string value that had before, and now add bottom, and then we're going to add the bottom element dot value, and then add our semicolon. And I gotta get a semicolon up there too. And then duplicate this line, and then this one will be the right element. Okay, so now this CSS variable has 3 CSS properties. We did position, and we got the value from our dropdown. Added a semicolon. Then we added to that CSS variable the bottom CSS property. We got the bottom element and got the value from that. Added a semicolon. Then we get the right CSS property. We get the right element, get the value from that, and add the semicolon. So this has 3 CSS properties, and we're setting that to the style attribute of this puppy element. So all of this code, update element, runs either when I change the value here, or I change the value here, or I change the value here. Okay, so this is the onChange event. All right, so let's reload the page. So here we go. It's static. I change it to relative. That seems to work. Let's make this 100. So now it should be 100 pixels from the right. Now notice nothing's changed. This only happens once I lose focus. That's when the value officially changes. That's when the event happens. Okay. So right element. Did I call that CSS right? Did. Max 800. Okay, so it's not updating somewhere. We can check and see right element. Console.log and see what value we get here. We're going to log out the element and then log out the element.value and see what we get. Okay, so we do get that. We do get a value of 40. Inspect element. Bottom. Oh, I didn't add the PX. Okay, so it doesn't know what 20 is. I have to add the px down here. That's the problem. Okay, so bottom, and then you specify a value. The value I got from the text box was just the number 20, but there's no px at the end. So here I need to add px, and then here I need to add px. Now this should work. You have to set the units, because remember, this is just CSS. So if we don't set the units or we don't set the CSS correctly, this won't work. Reload the page, go relative, and now I can change this to 100. Nothing changes until it loses focus, and now we see it's moved over from the right side 100 pixels. From the bottom side, we can say -40. Right, and then we can move this, absolute, or we can move it fixed. Okay, so this is how you use JavaScript to make an interactive page. These are just a couple of the events. This is the onChange event. Right? And so this is how the CSS Position property works. And now any new CSS properties we learn about, you can set up these controls to kind of play with the values possible with that CSS property. Okay, so this is a really good exercise to get used to selecting elements and learning new CSS properties. I highly recommend when you learn a new CSS property, you just put together a little demo just like this, where you have a title, a little stage area to see the effects, and then some controls, and then you play with the CSS values, and you can see what happens on the page. All right. So that is CSS positioning and using JavaScript to interact with the page.